For 5 centuries, one name has been synonymous with cunning, manipulation, and ruthless ambition: Niccolò Machiavelli. His work, The Prince, has been simultaneously celebrated and condemned, studied in universities and whispered about in boardrooms. But here's what's fascinating. Most people who invoke his name have never actually read his work, and those who have often miss his deeper point entirely. Today, we're going to explore something more nuanced than the ends justify the means. We're going to examine what Machiavelli actually observed about human nature, power, and the uncomfortable relationship between morality and effectiveness. This isn't about becoming ruthless. It's about understanding the hidden costs that come with different approaches to life, leadership, and achievement. So let's begin with a question that might make you uncomfortable. What is the actual price of morality in a world that doesn't always reward it? Number 1. The historical context. Who was Machiavelli really? To understand Machiavelli's ideas, you need to understand his world. Florence, Italy, early 1500s. The Italian peninsula was a battlefield. City-states rose and fell. Foreign armies invaded regularly. Alliances shifted like sand. Machiavelli wasn't an armchair philosopher. He was a diplomat, a civil servant who witnessed firsthand how power actually worked. He watched as moral leaders were deposed, as kind rulers were conquered, as principled governments collapsed. And then he watched as shrewd, sometimes ruthless leaders survived and even thrived. The Prince wasn't written as a guide to evil. It was written as an unflinching observation of reality. Here is how power actually operates, regardless of how we wish it operated. The question that started it all. Machiavelli asked something radical. Is it better for a leader to be loved or feared? His answer shocked Renaissance Italy. It is far safer to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. But notice what he's actually saying. He's not advocating for cruelty. He's observing that when resources are scarce, when survival is at stake, when competing interests collide, affection alone is an unreliable foundation for security. This observation extends far beyond politics. It touches on something we all experience: the tension between being good and being effective. Number 2. The morality paradox. The uncomfortable truth. Here's the paradox at the heart of human social life. We admire virtue, but we reward results. Think about it honestly. In your own life, have you ever seen someone who was genuinely kind, honest, and principled get passed over for a promotion? Have you watched someone who was less scrupulous succeed where the ethical person struggled? This doesn't mean morality is worthless. It means something more complex. Morality and effectiveness operate on different planes, and sometimes they conflict. Machiavelli observed that leaders who insisted on being good in all circumstances, who refused to adapt their approach based on context, often failed. And when they failed, everyone under their care suffered the consequences. So here's the hidden cost. Rigid morality without strategic thinking can lead to ineffectiveness. And ineffectiveness has its own moral cost. The question of hypocrisy. Let's be honest about something else. Most of the people who teach absolute moral standards don't actually follow them when their own vital interests are at stake. Your parents told you to always share, but did they share their resources indiscriminately? Your teachers told you to be completely honest, but did they tell you every truth about how the world actually works? Your leaders preach humility, but do they practice it when competing for limited opportunities? This isn't an attack on these people. It's an observation. They've learned something you might not have learned yet. They understand that different situations call for different responses. Machiavelli would call this prudence. Others might call it hypocrisy. But what if it's actually wisdom? The real deception. The real deception isn't that some people are strategic. It's that you were taught to be predictable while others learned to be adaptable. You were taught that questioning these approaches makes you morally suspect. That thinking strategically about human interactions makes you manipulative. That protecting your legitimate interests makes you selfish. Meanwhile, the people teaching you these lessons often reserved the right to be more flexible when their own important goals were involved. Number 3. Virtue versus virtue. A critical distinction. Machiavelli made a distinction that's lost in most translations. He distinguished between virtue, moral goodness, and virtu, effectiveness, capability, strategic excellence. Virtue is about being good. Virtu is about being effective. Here's what he observed. History doesn't remember people for their virtue alone. It remembers them for their virtu, for their ability to shape outcomes and create lasting change. This might sound cynical, but consider it carefully. A leader with perfect virtue but no virtu cannot protect their people. A person with impeccable morals but no strategic thinking cannot achieve their goals. Good intentions without capability often lead to well-meaning failure. The capability imperative. Think about any goal you care deeply about. Maybe it's providing for your family. Maybe it's creating positive change in your community. Maybe it's building something meaningful. Now ask yourself, will virtue alone achieve this goal? Or do you also need virtu, the capability to navigate complex situations, to understand human psychology, to make strategic decisions that serve your larger purpose? Machiavelli's observation was that virtue often requires actions that pure virtue might forbid. The effective leader sometimes needs to make uncomfortable decisions. The strategic person sometimes needs to withhold complete transparency. The capable individual sometimes needs to prioritize certain relationships over others. This doesn't mean abandoning morality. It means recognizing that effectiveness itself has moral value. The morality of effectiveness. Here's a perspective that might challenge you. There's something deeply moral about being effective. If you fail to achieve your legitimate goals because you limited yourself to approaches that feel pure but don't work, who benefits? If you can't protect what matters to you because you refuse to develop strategic capability, whose fault is that? The parent who cannot provide for their children because they refuse to negotiate effectively for fair compensation. Are they being moral or ineffective? The leader who cannot protect their team because they refuse to understand organizational politics. Are they being virtuous or naive? Machiavelli would argue that effectiveness is not opposed to morality. Sometimes effectiveness is the highest moral calling because it enables you to actually create the positive outcomes you claim to value. Number 4. The psychology of social conditioning. The predictability problem. Let's talk about something uncomfortable. Your predictability. When you always respond the same way, when you always prioritize being nice over being effective, when you always avoid difficult conversations, you become predictable. And predictability can be exploited. Think about common advice you've received. Always avoid conflict. Never prioritize your own interests. Forgive everything immediately. Always be accommodating. These sound noble, but they often translate to avoid necessary conversations that could solve problems. Let others consistently prioritize their needs while you neglect yours. Give unlimited chances to repeat harmful behaviors. Let people cross your boundaries without consequences. Who benefits from this advice? Is it you? Or is it people who prefer that you remain non-challenging, accommodating, and easy to manage? The pattern of exploitation. Here's a pattern Machiavelli observed and that you can observe in your own life. Someone consistently interrupts you in meetings. You stay quiet to avoid conflict. They continue dominating conversations. Everyone thinks you're considerate. But what actually happened? Your contributions were silenced, and social conditioning convinced you this was appropriate. Someone takes credit for your work. You tell yourself collaboration matters most. It happens again and again. You're being generous, but you're training people that your contributions don't need acknowledgement. Someone repeatedly asks for favors without reciprocating. You tell yourself giving is its own reward. The imbalance grows. You feel resentment but suppress it because good people don't keep score. Every single time, you convince yourself you're being virtuous. But really, you're being predictably exploitable. The intelligence of boundaries. Machiavelli observed that the most effective people understand something crucial. Boundaries aren't cruel. They're essential. The person who can say no when appropriate has more power to say yes meaningfully. The person who can challenge problematic behavior creates healthier relationships than the person who enables it. The person who can protect their legitimate interests while helping others achieves more lasting positive impact than the person who gives without wisdom. This isn't about becoming harsh. It's about becoming complete. It's about understanding that kindness without boundaries eventually becomes enabling. Forgiveness without accountability becomes permission. Accommodation without reciprocity becomes exploitation. Breaking the conditioning. The first step is awareness. Recognize when you're following social conditioning that serves others' comfort more than your authentic development. Ask yourself, who specifically benefits if I doubt myself right now? Who gains if I remain passive in this situation? Who profits if I don't advocate for myself here? The second step is reframing. When someone suggests you're being too assertive, you don't defend yourself. You simply think, I'm taking appropriate responsibility for my interests and goals. When they call you ambitious, you don't apologize. You recognize, I'm developing my capability to contribute. When they try to make you feel guilty for wanting success, you don't explain yourself. You understand that their discomfort with your growth is not your problem to solve. Number 5. Strategic ethics in practice. Beyond binary thinking. Most people think ethics is binary, right or wrong, good or evil, moral or immoral. But Machiavelli understood something more sophisticated. Ethical behavior is contextual. The right action depends on circumstances, consequences, and larger purposes. This is what I call strategic ethics. The ability to choose how you apply your values based on what actually creates the most positive impact in complex situations. Here's the framework. Deploy kindness when it builds valuable relationships and trust. When being genuinely helpful creates mutual respect and opportunities for collaboration, be the most generous person in the room. Choose transparency when it serves constructive outcomes. When honesty builds credibility or positions everyone for better decisions, share complete information. Show forgiveness when it demonstrates strength and creates opportunities for improvement. When second chances come with clear expectations, be appropriately forgiving. But adapt when these approaches don't serve your larger purpose. When kindness enables harm, when transparency damages unnecessarily, when forgiveness is misinterpreted as permission, choose different approaches that actually create positive outcomes. Real-world application. Let me give you concrete examples of strategic ethics in action. The chronic favor asker. Someone consistently requests help but never reciprocates. The conventional response. Keep giving because that's what good people do. The strategically ethical response. Help them understand that healthy relationships require balance by making future assistance conditional on mutual support. Here's the deeper insight. By continuing to enable one-sided relationships, you're actually harming that person. You're preventing them from learning reciprocity. Strategic ethics recognizes that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is establish boundaries. The uncomfortable truth. You have information that could benefit you but might be uncomfortable for someone else to hear. The conventional response. Agonize over what's nice. The strategically ethical response. Consider how to share important information in ways that serve everyone's long-term interests. Machiavelli observed that leaders who withheld uncomfortable truths to avoid short-term discomfort often created long-term disasters. The problem that could have been solved early becomes catastrophic later. The workplace dilemma. A team member consistently underperforms, forcing others to compensate. The conventional response. Be patient, avoid conflict. The strategically ethical response. Have a direct conversation about expectations with clear consequences. Why is this strategic ethics? Because allowing underperformance harms everyone. It burdens high performers, teaches the underperformer that mediocrity is acceptable, and jeopardizes the team's mission. The moral trade-off. You lead a non-profit serving vulnerable populations. To expand your impact, you need funding from a donor whose other business practices you question. The conventional response. Refuse on principle. The strategically ethical response. Carefully evaluate whether accepting this funding, with appropriate boundaries, would allow you to help significantly more people. Machiavelli would recognize this as a classic trade-off: moral purity versus practical impact. Which choice actually serves your values more authentically? The morality of results. Here's what Machiavelli understood that many people miss. There is a morality to achieving results. A leader who maintains perfect personal virtue but loses their position cannot help their people. A person who follows every rule but achieves nothing meaningful has limited their positive impact. The question isn't, should I abandon my values? It's, should I expand my methods so my values can actually create positive change in complex situations? The integration challenge. How do you maintain your core values while practicing strategic ethics? Through continuous reflection on purpose. Before any strategic action, ask yourself, what is my authentic purpose in this situation? Am I trying to create genuine positive impact, or am I rationalizing self-interest? What are the likely consequences of different approaches? Not just for me, but for everyone involved? Am I choosing this approach because it's truly more effective, or because it's more comfortable? If this action became public, could I defend it honestly as serving a larger ethical purpose? These questions keep strategic ethics from devolving into pure self-interest disguised as sophistication. The accountability factor. Strategic ethics requires accountability to results. You can't claim to be acting strategically for ethical purposes and then fail to achieve those purposes. This is the test. Strategic ethics should produce demonstrably better outcomes for more people over time. If it doesn't, you're doing it wrong. You can still be generous when generosity advances constructive outcomes. You can still be transparent when honesty serves authentic interests. You can still forgive when forgiveness creates opportunities for genuine improvement. But when those approaches don't work, when being simplistically good means being ineffective, you need other options. Better options that still serve ethical purposes and that you're honest about whether they're actually working. Number 6. The path of virtue. From virtue to virtue. The transition from pure virtue to strategic virtue isn't about becoming manipulative. It's about becoming complete. It means developing the full range of ethical and strategic responses so you can choose the most constructive approach for each unique situation. Think about people you genuinely admire, people who've created meaningful positive change. Did they succeed by applying simple ethical rules regardless of context? Or did they succeed by being strategically ethical, choosing their battles, timing their actions wisely, using every appropriate tool to achieve their larger mission? Leaders like Nelson Mandela, Winston Churchill, or Abraham Lincoln faced impossible moral dilemmas. They made decisions that pure virtue might have forbidden, but that their larger purpose demanded. They understood that leadership requires the capability to act effectively, not just the intention to be good. The development of strategic capability. Developing virtue means cultivating several capabilities. First, situational awareness. Understanding that different contexts require different responses. What works in one relationship might not work in another. What's appropriate in one situation might be ineffective in a different situation. Second, psychological understanding. Recognizing that people respond to incentives, social proof, and strategic presentation. Effectiveness requires understanding human nature as it is, not as we wish it were. Third, tactical flexibility. Being able to adapt your approach based on what actually creates positive outcomes rather than rigidly following predetermined scripts. Fourth, strategic patience. Knowing when to act immediately and when to wait for the right moment. Understanding that timing often matters as much as action. These capabilities don't make you less ethical. They make you more effective at creating ethical outcomes in an imperfect world. Number 7. Living with complexity. The discomfort of sophistication. Here's something nobody tells you about developing virtue. It's uncomfortable. Once you understand strategic ethics, once you see how power and influence actually work, you can't unsee it. And you'll face a peculiar kind of loneliness. You'll watch people around you operate on simple moral frameworks, and you'll recognize both the beauty and the limitation of their approach. You'll see them make predictable choices that sometimes harm their own interests and the people they care about. And you'll face a choice. Do you try to explain this more sophisticated understanding? Or do you recognize that most people aren't ready for it and might judge you for even suggesting it? This is the burden of strategic thinking. You see complexity where others see simplicity. You recognize trade-offs where others see clear answers. You understand that many situations don't have right answers, only choices with different consequences. The danger of rationalization. But here's the crucial warning. Strategic ethics can become a sophisticated form of self-deception. It's remarkably easy to convince yourself that you're being strategically ethical when you're actually just rationalizing self-interest. It's seductive to believe that your convenient choice happens to be the strategically optimal one. This is why Machiavelli, despite his reputation, actually emphasized virtue more than most people realize. He didn't advocate for abandoning ethics. He advocated for being honest about when ethical purity conflicts with effectiveness and being accountable for the consequences of your choices. Here are warning signs that you're rationalizing rather than practicing strategic ethics. First, you always discover that the strategic choice happens to be the most beneficial for you personally. If your strategic thinking consistently leads to decisions that serve your comfort or advantage without real benefit to others, you're probably fooling yourself. Second, you avoid accountability for outcomes. Strategic ethics requires that you be accountable for whether your approach actually creates better results. If you're not measuring outcomes, not reflecting on whether your strategic choices worked, you're just making excuses. Third, you become cynical. If you start believing that everyone is purely self-interested, that ethics is just a facade, that manipulation is all that matters, you've crossed from strategic wisdom into cynical nihilism. True virtue maintains respect for genuine virtue even while recognizing its limitations. Fourth, you lose the ability to act from pure virtue when appropriate. If you become so strategic that you can't simply help someone without calculating advantage, you've lost something essential. Strategic ethics should expand your range, not eliminate your capacity for simple goodness. The integration challenge. The real mastery is knowing when to be the lion and when to be the fox. When to be strategically sophisticated and when to be simply good. Some situations don't require strategy. Sometimes pure virtue is both effective and appropriate. A friend in crisis doesn't need your strategic analysis. They need your genuine support. A child learning values doesn't need nuanced ethical complexity. They need clear principles. The mark of true wisdom is discerning which situations call for which approach. In relationships built on genuine trust and mutual care, pure virtue often works beautifully. In competitive environments where resources are limited and interests conflict, strategic thinking becomes necessary. In situations involving vulnerable people or children, protection and simple goodness take precedence. The sophisticated person doesn't apply the same lens to every situation. They recognize that life involves fundamentally different types of interactions, each with different dynamics and different ethical requirements. The question of character. Here's what keeps this entire framework from devolving into sophisticated selfishness. Character. Machiavelli wrote for princes, people responsible for the welfare of entire populations. His advice makes sense in that context because the stakes are high enough to justify strategic compromises. But most of us aren't princes. Most of our decisions don't involve the fate of nations. So we must ask ourselves, when do the stakes justify strategic ethics, and when should we default to simple virtue? Character is what answers this question honestly. Character is what prevents you from pretending that every situation is high stakes to justify convenient choices. Character is what keeps you accountable to your larger purpose rather than just your immediate desires. A person of character asks, am I being strategic because the situation genuinely warrants it, or because I'm uncomfortable with the virtue approach? They're honest with themselves about their motivations. The social dimension. There's another complexity worth addressing: other people's perception of your strategic ethics. If you practice strategic ethics well, you'll sometimes be misunderstood. People operating on simpler frameworks may judge your contextual approach as inconsistent or unprincipled. You'll be criticized for being too calculating or not genuine enough. This is inevitable. People who haven't wrestled with these complexities often can't understand those who have. But here's what matters: don't let misunderstanding push you toward defensiveness or secrecy. Don't become the person who pretends to operate on simple virtue while secretly practicing strategic ethics. That's actual hypocrisy. Instead, be honest about your approach when appropriate. Acknowledge that you're trying to balance multiple values and that sometimes this requires difficult trade-offs. Most people will respect honesty about complexity more than they respect false simplicity. The continuous practice. Developing and maintaining virtue isn't a one-time achievement. It's a continuous practice of reflection and adjustment. Regular self-examination questions. Am I becoming more effective at creating positive impact, or just more sophisticated at serving myself? Honest assessment of outcomes over time. Am I maintaining my capacity for simple virtue, or am I losing it? Check whether you can still act from pure goodness when appropriate. Am I being honest with myself about my motivations? This might be the hardest question of all. Am I building the kind of character I want to have long-term? Strategic ethics should build character, not erode it. Are the people I most respect navigating similar challenges, or have I convinced myself that my approach is more sophisticated than theirs? Sometimes what looks like simple virtue in others is actually very sophisticated wisdom choosing simplicity. The paradox of mastery. Here's the final paradox. The true master of strategic ethics often looks like someone practicing simple virtue. They've become so good at discernment that they know exactly when strategy is needed and when simplicity serves better. They don't overthink every interaction. They've internalized the principles so deeply that they act with apparent spontaneity while actually drawing on deep wisdom. The beginner in strategic thinking applies it everywhere and becomes exhausting. The intermediate practitioner tries to balance different approaches and appears inconsistent. The master appears natural, authentic, and simple, but this simplicity emerges from sophisticated understanding, not from naivety. This is what Machiavelli ultimately pointed toward, not sophisticated manipulation, but wisdom that can hold complexity lightly. Not the abandonment of virtue, but the integration of virtue with practical intelligence. Your responsibility. If you're engaging seriously with these ideas, you have a responsibility to use this understanding ethically. Strategic thinking without ethical grounding becomes manipulation. Intelligence without character becomes dangerous. Understanding power dynamics without caring about others becomes predatory. But strategic thinking with genuine values becomes leadership. Intelligence with character becomes wisdom. Understanding power with care for others becomes the ability to create meaningful positive change. Machiavelli has been blamed for much evil that people did in his name while ignoring what he actually wrote. Don't add to that legacy. If these ideas resonate with you, let them make you more effective at serving your authentic values, not more sophisticated at betraying them. The price we pay. So we return to our central question. What is the price of morality? If morality means rigid adherence to simple rules regardless of consequences, the price is often ineffectiveness. The cost is limited impact. The result is good intentions without meaningful outcomes. But if morality means the commitment to creating positive impact using whatever ethical and strategic tools are appropriate for each situation, then morality and effectiveness become aligned rather than opposed. Machiavelli's hidden truth isn't that you should abandon morality. It's that you should question whether your understanding of morality is actually serving your authentic values or just making you feel good while achieving less. The real question. The real question isn't, should I be good or effective? It's, how can I be both good and effective? How can I maintain my core values while developing the strategic capability to make those values matter in the real world? How can I be ethically principled and practically successful? How can I be the kind of person who creates meaningful positive change rather than just thinking about it? Your path forward. Right now, you have a choice. You can continue operating with simplified approaches that may limit your impact, or you can develop more sophisticated understanding that expands your effectiveness. You can remain predictable, accommodating, and easy to manage, or you can become strategic, capable, and influential. You can keep being someone who means well but achieves less. Or you can become someone who means well and achieves more. The world needs more people who can be both ethical and effective, both principled and practical, both values-driven and strategically intelligent. It needs people who understand that the highest ethical calling isn't maintaining personal moral purity. It's building enough capability and influence to make ethical choices actually matter and create lasting positive change. The final insight. Machiavelli's work has been misunderstood for 5 centuries because people focus on his most provocative statements rather than his deeper observation. The world operates by certain principles whether we acknowledge them or not. The only question is whether you're going to understand how influence, power, and human psychology actually work, or whether you'll continue operating with incomplete information while others achieve the goals you dream about. This isn't about becoming ruthless. It's about becoming complete. This isn't about abandoning your values. It's about expanding your methods so your values can create meaningful impact. This isn't about choosing between morality and effectiveness. It's about recognizing that true morality includes the responsibility to be effective. The price of morality, as Machiavelli understood, isn't that you must become immoral to succeed. It's that you must become sophisticated enough to recognize that simple morality in a complex world often accomplishes less than strategic ethics guided by genuine values. The question isn't whether you'll pay a price. The question is which price you'll pay. The price of naive virtue that limits your impact, or the price of strategic development that expands your capability to create the positive change you authentically care about. Choose wisely. The world you create depends on it.